Welcome back to the Stable Moments podcast. I'm Rebecca Britt, your host, and today we are talking to a very special guest, Joan Ulsher, who wrote the book Misplaced Childhood. Now, she was in foster care and then she was actually returned back home, but this is not just a story of trauma. This is a story of a person who endured childhood trauma, understood and experienced the injustices of the system, and then went ahead and went to the Army and had a whole career and retired, and then chose to use her experiences to become a child advocate. And now she has written a book so that she can help others understand, empathize, and find their role in being the solution to our foster care crisis and to just helping kids in need and advocating for them. So I am going to go ahead and roll that intro, and then you will meet Joan. I'm Rebecca Britt, and this is the Stable Moments podcast. I started this podcast to understand from all perspectives how we can help end the foster care crisis. The overwhelming response was we need to support our local communities. Unwanted, abandoned, orphaned children are the community's responsibility. We must support, guide, love, invest, raise up generations that will nurture, love, and support their own children to end this crisis. So, the purpose of this podcast is to build an army of people that are interested and willing to take responsibility of our foster youth and who are supportive of foster and adoptive families. This is the on-ramp for people who want to get involved but might not know where to start. I want this to be a place where community members feel like they can make a difference, where they feel good enough to make that difference, and believe that they can be a big deal in the life of a child. Thanks for being part of our community, and make sure to join the conversation in the Stable Moments podcast Facebook group. Together, we can end the foster care crisis. Hey, Joan, thank you so much. I'm so happy to have you on the Stable Moments podcast and excited to learn more about your book. I would love for you to just give a brief introduction on who you are in relation to child advocacy before we dive in.
Thank you for having me. I am a court-appointed special advocate. It's a volunteer program that represents the advocacy of children in foster care. I became a CASA about 5 years ago in San Antonio. So my local program is called Child Advocate San Antonio. We're part of a huge network under the umbrella of the National CASA and GAL Association. This was my calling in life, so it took me a little bit longer to get here than most people because I started after a 20-year career in the Army. But I love what I'm doing.
Well, tell us a little bit about your background specifically, like if you have a background in the Army, like what led up to being a child advocate?
I took the long road. I had a very traumatic childhood. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, 70s, 80s, back when there weren't really a lot of child advocacy networks out there. So I ended up in foster care at one point, got returned home. And my brother, let me back up a little. So there were four of us as children, and two of us, myself and my older brother, Joey, went into foster care. We really just begged to get taken away. And we finally did, but I got sent home and it didn't make any sense to me, but he never did. So he aged out of care and he joined the Army. And it wasn't until he joined the Army that I was able to get communication with him again. So essentially going into care at about age 15, that was the last day I ever saw him alive. He joined the military and we had some writing back and forth. And then I thought, wow, he sounds like he's doing well. He's got a future. He escaped this trauma from childhood. He's out of Buffalo and he's going to make a career out of this. So I decided I'm going to do the same thing. So I enlisted in the Army at age 17. Weird. Both my parents, had assigned permission because I wasn't an adult yet. And then I went off to college in the reserves and graduated college, to the Army, graduated or completed the Army. And I talk about some of this in my book, being married and whatnot. But retiring in San Antonio, I just really never put a whole lot of thought to my past or working with children, but until I met a young man across the street at a barbecue and he was in foster care. My neighbors just kind of prefaced the whole barbecue as, oh, you're going to meet this young man. He's in foster care. His family doesn't want him. He's a friend of our son's. And so I was like, oh, okay, I want to meet him. And from that day, and this is going back maybe 14 years ago, I started mentoring him. and I didn't expect that relationship to happen, but it just really grew organically because we didn't talk about our experiences, but we knew that we needed each other. He needed somebody there for him, and I felt like people had kind of been there for me at various stages, and so we just started that naturally. And then it wasn't till fast forward years later, 2018, and my husband's just walking out the door one day and goes, "Oh, I'm going to this CASA training," and I was like, "What? Wait, what? What's CASA training?" And so once he explained it to me, I started getting online and researching it. And that was the moment the blinders came off. And I realized there was this whole other world of child advocacy because I didn't have it when I was a youth. And then the young man that I had befriended and became a mentor for, he didn't have one either. So neither one of us knew anything about it. And then boom, I just started the process. And now that I'm involved in it, it's pretty much what I do full time as a volunteer. Can't stop talking about trying to get people to become CASA or even GAL advocates. So the guardian ad litem might be in another state or another jurisdiction. But yeah, it's definitely the long road to get there.
Well, I love that you were able to provide mentorship kind of organically, and that led to the rest of your story. You said something that drew my attention, where you said, like, as a child, you were trying to get removed. Like, you wanted to be removed.
Yeah.
And the reason why I want to chat about that for a second is because so often when we're training mentors, we talk about, like, these kids often don't have a perspective that, like, my home was horrible and now I've come to this great place. They have a perspective like that they were removed from the only thing they ever know. So it's really interesting to me to hear this other perspective of, like, no, we really wanted to be removed. So can you just tell me a little bit more about that?
I always knew there was some sort of dysfunction in our home. And, from a young age in my book, I think I only go back to maybe about memories at age 8. And it began with domestic violence. So seeing my father suffer from alcoholism, come home and viciously beat my mother. That's kind of what I initially remember. But then when we were trying to intervene, then we became the victims as well. And then it was just a free for all. It just seemed like from that period on, it didn't matter who you were, whether you were mom or whether you were one of the children, or whether it was dad was the abuser or mom was the abuser. It was just chaos. And I just knew from an early moment, like even watching fictionalized TV shows like Brady Bunch, the Waltons, Eight is Enough, that I was like, those parents seem different. Why are my parents different? And when you're a young child, you don't often compare what's going on in your friends' homes. You just assume, well, they must be going through the same thing, and nobody else talks about this. But we did reach out to the authorities on a number of times, running to the police station to alert them, and then everything just it fell on deaf ears, or we weren't taken seriously. Or if they did appear at our house, we were coerced and maybe somewhat extorted to recant. So this was going on for years. And by the time my brother Joe and I finally got removed, I don't know who initiated that. I'll never understand where that came from. If it was, a teacher or a neighbor, somebody finally just said, enough's enough. What's going on behind that door has to stop. So that last time when they came, it just seemed like they weren't willing to take us recanting as an answer. So we didn't. And we just said, please. And then it became a fight with the investigators and my mother. And then eventually we just were taken. But I know you're right. There are a lot of children that feel like they've done something wrong in their house and they were removed, and they love that parent, whether it was a dysfunctional or neglectful situation. The children are often very much traumatized because they've been removed from the only parent they knew. And I think in my case, it's probably the unusual circumstance of just, no, I can't do this anymore. I have to survive, and that means getting out of here. We have both circumstances, but for sure, all the children I've worked with, the majority have just please, I want to go home.
You also said something that is very interesting. And I would love you to respond to this from the perspective of your childhood, but then also what you've seen as a CASA. So you were removed, but just you were returned. So one, that seems crazy. Two, I wonder, I know that you said back then there weren't the same type of child protective policies in place, and you didn't have a court appointed advocate. But nowadays, like, is it typical that if children are removed, if one child is removed, that it's deemed that those parents wouldn't be fit for any children?
That's a great question. I don't have any professional experience in knowing what each jurisdiction is going to require. Back in the day, yeah, there were four of us. My older sister was probably already 18 at the time. So I don't know what her, and my younger brother was several years younger than me. And I don't think he was really aware of a lot was going on. I think that the brunt of everything was kind of my middle brother and I. Um, when I got returned home, I asked my mom, like, hey, where's Joey? Why didn't he come home? And she like kind of bragged, like, well, I didn't want him. I made him a ward of the state, PINS petition, a person in need of supervision. And I'm like, well, how come I didn't get a say? Because the driving force for me writing my current book was, geez, this terrible childhood happened to me. And I didn't get a say. I had nobody to speak for me, but now I'm doing this for children that they also not necessarily getting a say. They're being removed, and I would suspect that from the cases I've worked with, all the children are removed. But during the case of, let's say you've got a family of five, and all five of the children go into care for neglect, let's say, because the vast majority of children coming into the foster care system are because of neglect more than the abuse. So let's say there's a neglectful situation and five children get removed, but then mom's also pregnant. But the children are removed. Later, you're advocating for them and you're going through the court process, but then the baby is born. CPS may come in and decide we're either going to remove that child or not. And I've had both circumstances where the child remained with mom while the other five children were working their way through the system, and mom was doing what she needed to do. And then in other instances where they've come in, they've drug tested the parent and said, we got to take the baby too. But I think that because my circumstances in entering foster care were 40 years ago, it's hard to believe it was that long ago, but 40 years ago, 1983, I do want to believe that the system is better in 2023, and that if there is a report of one child being abused in the home, I would think that they do sweep in and take everybody. What I'm now finding with the advent of my book coming out is that my younger brother has found my website. He's aware that I'm writing a book, and he has a different opinion. So he has a different opinion about what childhood was like, and I don't know his motivations or whatnot, but that's obviously a problem when you have one child say, no, you never went into foster care, you weren't abused, this didn't happen to Joey. And then it's like, no, it was a really true lived experience. You have somebody discounting it, it's tough. And I think that if that were to continue happening today, where one or two children were taken away and two or more or one were left behind, there's an opportunity for the parent or the parents to manipulate that child and fill them with a whole bunch of other facts or circumstances. And I guess I never reconciled that over the last 40 years. I never had a good relationship with my younger brother, but just 40 years later, I'm just hearing that he never knew what happened to me or his older brother. And wow. So I hope that doesn't happen to kids today. But in the same token, if one is being abused, they likely all are. They all need some sort of intervention.
Yeah, I remember. So I have cousins that are adoptive cousins, and my aunt and uncle adopted them, and they were actually in a foster home, and that's where they received their abuse. And the culmination of one of them coming into care was she was 3 and she was put in scalding water and burnt for peeing her pants, burnt over half of her body. And so she was in the hospital, and that's when they took her and the 6-year-old, and they were biological siblings, but that foster family had biological children. And the only children that were removed was my adoptive cousins. So the children that they were fostering were removed for extreme abuse and neglect.
Yeah.
and their biological children were allowed to stay. I guess because there was no evidence that they treated their biological children that way. But my mind just goes like, if you have the ability to harm any child that way, and I don't know. I know that I'm sure, tons of perspectives and experiences that go into making these decisions, and it's not black and white. I'm the first one to say, like, I don't know the right answer, but I remember.
Yeah, there's got to be a lot with the law, whatever the jurisdiction, and counties and states must also stipulate what the actions are going to be by the departments.
Well, that's why it's so important, though. Like, you didn't have a voice to leave. Your voice wasn't heard to leave, and your voice wasn't heard coming back. You would have made different decisions had your voice been heard on both of those accounts. So tell me a little bit more, and everybody that's listening, about the CASA role and how important it is to give kids that voice.
Okay, so the CASA role, I consider it vital because it's personal to me, given that I didn't have anybody advocate for me. I know that through the years, the model has used various terminology, like be the voice for the voiceless or whatnot. But I've met a number of youth that have come out of the foster care system, and they're now advocating or running successful businesses and whatnot. They never liked that term, that the advocate is their voice. I feel like with the younger children, oh, absolutely. If a child is 3, 5, 6, they may not be able to articulate to authorities after they've been removed what's going on with them or what they need or what they desire. So, of course, the CASA advocate would be fully trained and appointed on official orders by the judge to represent that family and be a fact finder for all information, therapies, education, medical, interactions with family, interactions with siblings, needs and desires. Those children do need that person to look into things a lot closer than a child protective service work could. They have just way more kids in the system and on their caseload. For the older children, what I like to say is that rather than being their voice, I'm more trying to empower them to have a voice. So mentoring and working with them and still doing the same fact finding and the same recommendations and concerns to the judge, but also I choose to work mostly with teenagers because I was a teen when I went into care. And so I want to feel like, in a way, I'm giving back to them so that they can see, like, hey, I wasn't able to do this when I was your age, but you know what? With my help by your side, you're 16, you're 17. Let's get you to see the judge face to face in his chambers. So, because I have to represent the child's best interests. And sometimes with a child who was removed from a very dangerous situation, they might be, I don't care what you want to happen for me. I just want to go to that home. And the home can be completely unsafe and dangerous and not in their best interests at that time. They can still talk to the judge and say, I still want to do this. But then the judge essentially has all the parties' information. They have what the attorneys are saying, they have what the CPS department is saying, they have what the child is saying, and they have what the advocate is saying. So the whole idea of having a CASA or GAL advocate volunteer on behalf of any children, any age, is that it gives the judge the most complete information and perspective about the child or sibling group before making a decision that could alter their future. I take it personally, and I guess that's how I see the whole CASA role.
I love that a lot because I think that when you hear about a CASA role who is being the voice for a child, if that's how you've heard about it,
Yes.
then you could think that you just listen to what the child wants and relays that. Or I love that you're saying that your job is fact finding, because my concern would be that your bias would come in. And I think it's easy for people, if they haven't had dysfunctional lives, to go into some of these families and go, she should definitely not, be in this family, or this isn't to my standard of like what raising a child good is, where we need to remove that bias, right? So
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that because almost in any field you're working in with youth, whether it's in a counselor role, therapist, a mentor, an advocate, yeah, you got to worry that is there going to be bias? And that's where I lay it out on the table with I do come with lived experiences that allow me to be in the shoes of a child that has been in care and now advocate on behalf of them. Does that mean because I had a terrible childhood and wanted to be removed, that all the children I work with should be the same situation? No. You have to put your personal perspective aside. I use what knowledge and experience I had in the past to help me lean on my commitment and my dedication to the kids, I think is where that really comes to. So instead of my traumatic past influencing exactly the decision making or the recommendations that I give to the judge, it's not that at all. It's the dedication that's poured into it. And then each child's situation is unique. It could even be that in a family of four youth, that you may have a different perspective on each child depending on what their needs are. I believe that the CASA program is a good model. We get at least 30 hours of training up front and then ongoing training through the year, and you're always under the guise of a supervisor. If there's a young advocate or an inexperienced advocate, and perhaps they might have some personal biases weighing in, that advocate supervisor is going to identify that. And they should. And if they don't, then hopefully when they're presenting in front of the judge, maybe certain language they're using, somebody might go, oh, hold on a second. I think we're missing something here. But I think that would be the exception, that there would be bias in that regard. One of the things that concerns me is that, yes, I wrote the story and I talk about, okay, I have this traumatic background. I got returned home after foster care and subject to more abuse. How am I going to be saved? But my caseload, my track record clearly shows that I've had every different outcome. We just did a successful reunion of 7 children with their parents. Love this family. Love this family. Love the kids. Love the mom. Just really horrendous situation that happened for the family. And another case where there was a sibling group and parental rights were terminated, yet several years later, one of the children reached out to me, was already adopted by another family member, but her brother was still languishing in a treatment center because he was just having behavioral difficulties, couldn't keep him in a foster home. He just kept blowing it up. So the young girl reached out to me and said, hey, I think you got to get in touch with my mom. I hear she's good. And I'm like, oh, what does that mean? And so, because she'd been terminated several years prior, and it was a really messy substance use issue. And I went and met with her, and like immediately started the phone calls and the emails to the child's attorney and the caseworker, and said, I think we need to come together on this. I think mom is ready to be reunited with her child, or her child is ready to be reunited with her. So even though termination had occurred years later and we still had children in care, one sibling's adopted, another's aged out, there's still some in care. The one girl's like, I think you can do something for my brother and get him back with my mom because I think she's ready to go. And yeah, it was great. It was great to see that. And everybody was happy in the end. So when I mentioned earlier that the child might tell the judge, like, yeah, I want to go home right now. And I'd be, well, maybe not right now. It could take a little while for the environment is safe and permanent. We don't want to send a child back home or recommend a child go home into an unsafe environment that's just going to blow up and lead to more trauma and another removal, because it's sad when there's repeated exposure to those traumas over and over again.
In the scenario you just brought up, that was above and beyond your CASA role, was it not?
Yeah. So I think, when I look at what I do as a CASA, I've represented 24 children so far to date in under 5 years. I probably spend about the same amount of time each year uh, outside of my role as a CASA, just independently keeping up with the children whose cases have closed.
Amazing.
So right now I've got 8 children, and they take whatever time is needed for the case. But equally, I've got all those other children that were either adopted or aged out or reunited, and there's still contact. So I spend a lot of time doing that. And I would say that, yeah, it's probably above and beyond because it's not part of what the program model says is a standard, but it is not discouraged at all. If you've got a child that you worked with a couple of years ago and they were adopted, the advice that a supervisor might say is before you reach out to that minor child who's adopted, make sure it's okay with the adoptive family or make sure it's okay with the reunified parent. If the child is under the age. So we wouldn't go out of our way and still interject ourselves as if we're carrying a court order. I wouldn't do that at all. But if my children, the former kids that I represented, if they reach out to me, then I'm all over and I'll respond. There was a birthday this weekend and then another one last month. So I love to keep in touch with the kids because that's where I can continue kind of that mentoring role for them and let them know like, hey, it's okay. I was where you were once. Now I'm here. I don't want you to get discouraged because maybe things aren't going as well as you had hoped wherever you landed right now, but there's still a future ahead of you. And I don't feel like I started my life until after I retired from the Army. So,
Hmm.
all my youth behind me and 20 years in the Army, and I don't think my life started until after that. So I just want all the children to know that don't live in the moment right now. If you're 13, 16, 18, 21, your life can still start way later.
I love that you're able and allowed and willing to continue on with these kids, continuing on with mentorship, especially if they are reaching out, because you don't want to just be, you get so involved in these kids' lives during one of the toughest parts of their lives, and you don't want to show that you really care. And then now that the case is done, I'm done with you. So that continuity
Exactly.
of care is so important. And we know the research behind mentorship, and we know the research behind healthy relationships with adults over time that actually care, or kids perceive that you actually care. So I would love for you to tell us a couple of examples of healthy adults that did come into your life and you felt like were a good role model for you or good mentors.
Part of my backstory in my book, the personal trauma I faced, I don't go into a whole great detail, but you'll find there's little darts that land on the board as you're flipping through the pages. Probably the first person was a neighbor next door, just called me Joni. I mean, my name's Joan because I'm from New York, and it's I was named after Saint Joan of Arc. But she always called me Joni, and she was the only person to ever do that in my life. And it was one of those things that just made me feel special. And she tried in her own way to support myself and my siblings. Her husband would buy ice cream when the Mr. Softy truck came through the neighborhood, and all the kids would come out and get ice cream, and she'd send like little bags of cookies over to our house. But what was going on in my house, if there was dysfunction and chaos happening, we were scurrying around and rolling up all the windows because there was still like we have to keep what's happening contained and secret in our house so that the neighbors don't know. But they did know. And it wasn't until later in the end of my high school experience that I went back to her to say, "Hey, I'm leaving. I'm going off to college, and I just wanted to tell you, how much I love and appreciate how you always tried to be there for me." And so it seems minor at this point, but I'd given her a hug, and she explained to me that, hey, Joni, we were always so worried about you. I wish there was more that could be done. She may have been the person that had been calling CPS all along or calling the police. I don't know. But she did alert my high school. And by calling my high school when I went there, I kind of always felt like I was being watched.
Mm.
And so I wasn't paranoid. It really was happening. She didn't tell me this till I was a senior. But she says, I called them all those years ago and said, please look out for this one. She's special. And I always felt then that the administrators and a teacher, an English teacher, just they focused in on me and just treated me differently. They listened to me and just gave me opportunities there. And then other folks through my life too, even ones that my mom is as sad of a life she had, tried to offer me like horseback riding lessons, so to take me under the wing and get me out of the city and into the country and ride some horses and have that relationship. A boss at my first job, the zoo, same situation. And by this point, when I'm at working at the Buffalo Zoo, I'm in foster care for part of this period. And after my first home experience, I get moved to a second home, and who greets me on the front steps of that house but my boss? And I thought, okay, this is shameful. I love my boss and she was great, but we never talked about the past. And I was in such shock that she knew, but her now as an adult, I can look back and go, oh, she was just trying to be there, to be a friendly face, a familiar face as I'm entering this second home for the first time. And I just shut down and was mortified. But yet there's more detail on this story in my book, but I still really loved my boss because I just saw myself following her career, and then going to college and just again happenstance. I don't know. Eventually, maybe it was just a God thing that just I had those fictionalized ideals of the parents in the TV shows, the characteristics I liked, and then I saw them in other people.
Mm.
So as I saw it in my neighbor and I saw it in my teacher, and then I saw it in the gal giving me horseback lessons, or in my boss at the zoo, or in my professor of military science at college, I saw the characteristics that I always wanted in a parent. And so when they equally looked back at me to give me any attention, I responded. I didn't reject them. So it was symbiotic. And I think sometimes today, when I'm trying to reach a child, that's the hardest connection to make. You're trying really hard to give your life to a child and implore modeling positive behaviors and empathy and concern and compassion, yet we can't control for when that child accepts that. And I
Mhm.
think all the mentors, even that you work with, probably can identify with that too. You just can't turn it on and off. It's completely organic. And um, so those people just were kind of placed sporadically through my life to just keep me on track and keep me focused towards the goal, which was get out of this chaotic life, get away from the toxicity of my family, develop a career to overcome, teetering on the edge of poverty, and just have a future goal apart from what my parents created for us.
Yeah, and know that kindness and people that will listen to you or see through to, the shining light you are, that they exist,
Yeah,
and
they
being able
do.
to see that. I actually love this story about your boss, because how often as mentors or people that are well-intentioned, or we try to do something that is like obviously in our head could only be perceived as the most amazing thing or supportive thing, kind thing, sweetest thing that we could ever do. And we're devastated, or just we don't understand when it isn't
Yep.
perceived that way. And oh my gosh, we're terrified if it's like perceived in a way that we were not being kind. And that those muddy waters, I think, often deter people from even wanting to get that close, because they're afraid of additional trauma. They're afraid of not knowing the right thing to say. They're afraid of not doing the right thing. And it is easier to stay in our comfort zone and to just stay home and pray rather than get out there and do. But I love that you kind of showed that, like, it's more of the net positive, with her good intention over and over again, being a good boss,
Yes.
showing up as a good person, even though there was, one or two things or whatever that could have been perceived or was perceived as like, oh, this isn't good for you. It was like this net positive of a human relationship that you still see it as, someone that was good for you.
Net positives. I never thought of it that way. And this is something where, okay, I'm not clinical background at all. I mean, my undergraduate degree was going towards zoology. I ended up having some difficult times, like most youth who had experienced a history of foster care. You struggle when you're on your own in college. So, there was the occasional failing or academic warning or whatever. 4 years took 5 years to complete. I had to change my major, so it was just like, oh, what can I complete just to get out and get to the army? So I have a degree in psychology, but I don't feel that I am an expert. So, in speaking with somebody like you, other social workers, LPCs, psychiatrists that have a clinical background and understand trauma, know how different each child's experience is going to be. So those net positives for me, I think, were the overarching reason that I survived and developed resiliency. But that moment when my boss, somebody who I really looked up to and respected, and I was terribly afraid of anybody finding out that I was in care or that I was being abused and some of the things that were going on at home. But when I guess it was the neighbor above her was the second foster home, they must have said like, "Oh, we have this kid coming. She's going to be in foster care in our house, and oh, we hear she works at the zoo." And then somehow that must be how the connection was made,
Mm.
where I meet my boss there on the steps first. But the way the trauma from that shameful experience affected me completely blacked out that entire experience in that home. I
Mm.
still remember going to school. I remember being at work. I remember taking the bus occasionally still to the zoo, but no memory of what happened in that house upstairs. It just was so shameful for me that it's literally wiped out of my mind. And in your experiences and professionalism, that trauma can just create a huge vacuum in
Yeah.
our brain, in our memories, in our functioning. I equate, if people ask me, or the kids that I'm advocating for ask me, well, how did you survive and whatnot? I just tell them honestly, like, I feel like my brain is Swiss cheese at times. I
Mm.
feel like, I remember this, but I lost that. I've lost some happy moments because of the things I've experienced. Still every now and then, even in the last couple of years writing this book, oh yeah, some more stuff, surface. So you'd go through the 70th iteration of the manuscript and then realize I'm going to go back and put a little more detail here because I do recall this now, having done this. There's no doubt when you write a personal memoir that has personal feelings and events and stories that things are going to surface. So things did surface, but still that memory at that home is just gone. So I don't know how to explain that.
That's amazing. And it seems like it very could be because it was started by something that felt so shameful, something that you honestly wanted to hide from
I
her. You
did.
didn't want her to know about it. So it would make
Yeah.
sense that your brain would go like, well, let's protect us from this too. This isn't
Yeah.
happening.
When I had graduated college, I guess I must have been 22 or 23. I was at my first military assignment in Alaska. The only time at that point where I really recall talking about even being in foster care was when I went to volunteer at the Covenant House, Alaska, a teen runaway shelter. And I really wanted to make a difference on the weekends and communicate with those children. And I remember becoming part of the Covenant House family as a volunteer and explaining to them that I'd been in care and that I'd run away a number of times. And I just kind of wanted somehow to be able to connect since I was now a young adult and still close to the age of many of the teens that were in there. But I even talked about that in the book that I never felt like I ever made a connection there. And so then I just end up, meeting my husband and going on and having this life. And it wasn't until I'm retired, 12 years into my marriage, and I meet the young man across the street and we connect as mentor and mentee that I tell my husband, like, well, yeah, of course I want to help this young man out. I was like, I was in foster care too. And he's like, well, because like it just was something that I was still so ashamed of,
Hmm.
and I didn't want to tell folks. And then I think it was probably another maybe 5 years after that that I even broke down with a bunch of friends back in high school, just going back and having a reunion from going from Texas to Buffalo and meeting up with them and saying like, well, yeah, I had these experiences, and they're like, oh my gosh, we had no idea. And I'm like, yeah, I went through a lot of painful processes to remain distance and hide things from them because I was ashamed.
Hmm.
And it took me decades to learn to deal with that shame.
I don't know how many, how we can break our life down into halves or thirds or however you want to break it down. But, I personally believe that for a lot of us, God does want to use our testimony or wants to use our pain for good, and that we can take what we've been through and channel it in a way that can be helpful for others, especially through the deep empathy that we gain from understanding exactly what it's like to be in someone's shoes and giving them what we needed so badly. But with that, if that's true, if you're going to use your testimony for good, it does mean breaking down all of the coping mechanisms that you created to protect
Yeah,
yourself from that thing that you're saying. And whether it's God or any higher whatever, whether you're saying no, like I've literally spent my whole life trying to rise above, forget, package that, put a bow on it. And now you're saying, you're calling me, you're leading me to this place where I may use it. But before I can use it, I have to unpack it. And that is like, it's hard to survive sometimes, just the
right.
unpacking. And yeah, I've lived that myself, where it's like, if you're gonna use all of that for good, you need to experience the bridge between the experience and the helping, because like what you're doing with your book, and what I've done with some of my materials, is there's self-disclosure, but none of it is about the self-disclosure. All of it is about the reader and what they can gain and the value you can add. Yes, I'll use my experience to show, to relate, to validate, to empathize, but the experience isn't about, oh, this happened to me and I'm a victim, or any of that. The experience is all about, what do we do with it?
That is so true. So one of the things I try to say over and over in the book, a couple different ways, my editor would call it word echoes, but I'm like, no, it's important to make this point. It's not what happened to me. It's not that traumatic story that you're going to read early in the book and then interspersed through the second half of the book where I really explore the CASA experience. It's what I'm doing with those experiences. So I guess I really still feel for people that are my age, that I meet, whether they're friends or people in church or speakers you might hear at a conference, and they're still suffering as a victim. I believe that sharing my story can be powerful because it means that it'll give weight and meaning for people out there in the United States that maybe don't have that same experience. They don't know what the comfort level is for children that have been traumatized or in care. There's a lot of healthy people walking around out there. My husband's family. Oh my gosh, they're just so normal. It's crazy because I had this chaos and then he's got this normal family, but he couldn't like initially relate to, well, what do you mean that happened to you? And this is why you act this way or something. And I'm like, no, everybody gets responds differently. But when you have those experiences and you can share them and shed light for the rest of the country that, hey, this may have happened to me 40 years ago, but it's still happening to children today in some shape or form. Use this information to empower you and to motivate and impassion you to serve these children. And so the way my book is kind of broken down, like I said, there's some trauma up front just to set the stage. This is what I experienced. And then the journey through that pain and how I ended up healing from it and being transformed into a life of purpose as an advocate. I will share some of the examples of some of the children's cases that I've worked on, merely to give people kind of a hand holding in this is my experience as a CASA. but I cannot go into the detail of all the seriousness or trauma or, detail and stuff of the muck for my children to protect their privacy. So
Right.
sharing my story gives that balance. This is still happening. And then when I talk about the children, the relationship with them is more, these are kind of some of the things that, an advocate would do with the children or advocate for, or some of the experiences you might have. But I'm not going to tell you, anything related to who abused them or what happened or what they went through or that kind of stuff. So each of us has a story that we can use for good, and it's not what happened to you, it's what you do with it. And one of the key phrases I use in the book is that if you see a child swimming in peanut butter, that's tough, that's rough, be their jelly. I
Mm.
was there before, swimming in peanut butter. It's hard. I mean, if you can just imagine. And now I feel like, all right, these children that are in foster care are in their own peanut butter too. And if I can be their jelly and make that peanut butter jelly sandwich so that we can kind of walk this process together, and they can learn from my healing, my resiliency, I in turn do see that from them as well. And it's powerful when you've realized how you healed and you found your resiliency, and then to see it in the children that you're serving. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, whether it's through therapy or just talking, being there, driving with them to see another sibling, answering any of their concerns and questions. Um, you got to take what we had happen and just do something with it constructively.
And it sounds like not only does your book help readers with that, but also maybe if a reader is sitting at home going, well, I had a great childhood and I just don't know how to even recognize peanut butter, and I don't know what being jelly means. It sounds like your book could help with, well, this is how you recognize a kid in peanut
Yes.
butter, and this is how you be jelly for them.
Yeah. I really believe every one of us can make a difference in some form, and if reading my book, somebody gets to the end and goes, wow, that CASA advocacy stuff is a lot. I'm not sure that it's for me, then I, call them to try something else they might be passionate about, whether it's becoming a foster parent or even being a kinship person, being aware of those distant relatives, could be in a neighboring state, could be just across the city. Do you know that those children, may have entered care or whatnot? We need more kinship families to step up and take their children in. We lost a tremendous amount of grandparents that were taking in children during the pandemic because of the health scares and that. So we lost grandparents that were usually the most prevalent of parties to step up and say, hey, those are, my grandkids from such and such child or whatever. I want to take them in while the parents are working through their case. We lost that, and we need more kinship families. We need foster families. We need CASA advocates to be there and do that fact finding and making recommendations to the judge. We need more people to enter into therapy and counseling, social work services, CPS caseworkers, mentors. Even in your program, the equine program, there's one not too far from me in the outer reach of San Antonio, but we just need people at all different levels to do something instead of just going, that particular area wasn't for me. I mean, surely you got a heart for kids. There's going to be something you can do. Or, okay, at the very minimum, open up your wallet.
Right.
Open up your wallet or share the messages. When you see the posts, when you see the podcast or the Instagram post from whomever, share those messages. It's going to reach somebody.
Yeah, or even changing your perspective. Like I really do think that a lot of the big rewards in life are just in the details. So it's like, try
Yeah.
not to judge, try to be helpful, try to be kind. I mean, even just not sharing the narrative that's the negative narrative, like going into, a Walmart and seeing a mom that's struggling. Oh, my kid would never act like that. Or, some of those stories that we naturally have in our head. But being able to change that narrative and hearing having your kids hear you say things like, well, maybe she's having a hard time, or we don't know what she's dealt with today. Just having that more kind perspective, because I just know for a lot of parents and a lot of kids, they are just, one of their biggest struggles is dealing with perceptions of other people, other society members.
That is so true. And this is like stepping outside the advocacy model here. Because you mentioned seeing somebody like in a Walmart or whatnot. I think we could probably fix the foster care system in the United States if we paid more attention to preventing the abuse and neglect from the get-go. And with that, I huge, huge issues. It's not one answer, but one thing we could start with in each community is focusing um, more efforts and supports on the families that we know that are struggling. Instead of a neighbor calling in a family next door because the child came over to borrow milk, and then the neighbor goes, well, that mom, I don't like that mom perception or whatever, doesn't have milk. I'm going to report the child. And then disproportionately, we end up seeing children of poverty being taken into care, neglect. We don't need to blow things up like that. We need to really focus on those really serious situations of abuse and neglect. And the perspective of just judging somebody walking into Walmart and seeing some kids getting out of control, or seeing a child on one of those little harnesses and leashes and turning them into, CPS. We need to look as a society at our members and embrace them as future of the community, and not rat them out, but help. You help the family next door, or you help your community leaders learn what some of the problems and the struggles are for people at all walks of life, whether it's race or socioeconomical status. Is somebody lost their job, lost their car, they got 10 children at home, and now they have no way of getting the children to school. So we're going to report them to CPS because the kids are truant. Well, can't we figure out as a society how we're going to get this parent a new van and maybe help with the job and get the children to school before we immediately sweep in and say you're a bad parent? I want to see supports improve for families. And once children enter the system, we also need to continue with those supports for those parents too. They're going to work services and try to improve their life because they were in a rough spot. Something happened. If we can work with them and help them and get them the supports they need to be an effective and a safe parent, then let's do it. Let's get the kids out of foster care. And if they need to go home, let's get them reunited. If that's not safe and permanent, let's find some fictive kin, some family, some grandma, some aunts, some uncles, cousins, even an older sibling. Something else I do that I talk about in the book, it's on my website as well, is that I rehab furniture for children that are going to their forever homes. So I've created I think it's 37 dressers so far, custom, and I'm working on 4 right now. I've got another one that's going to be delivered this week. But I get these dilapidated dressers. They remind me of the way I was as a child, just worn down and broken and distressed, and they need a lot of love and care to bring them back to life. But I do this, and I don't often know who the children are because of confidentiality, but a supervisor might reach out to me and say, hey, I've got a 16-year-old child that wants this is the next one coming up, solid white dresser with yellow stars. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's pretty simple. I mean, I get like Stranger Things, San Antonio Spurs, Frozen, Minecraft. I get these like really difficult requests, and then I just get, she just wants white with yellow stars. And I'm like, okay. And then the only other thing I know is that the child was taken in by a sibling that aged out of care. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And then the supervisor says, I can't, tell you who or their names or whatnot, but they also have a 5-year-old niece that wants unicorns. And I'm like, if this kid is 18 or 19 and took in a 16-year-old and a 5-year-old, it's going to make me cry. Yeah, white with yellow stars or unicorn.
Whatever they want.
If that's what they want, then God willing, I'm going to make it happen. And it's over 100 degrees out here in Texas, and I've been doing just a couple hours a day. But it's something that I can give back because I see the whole community of children as our future.
Hmm.
These eventually are going to be people that are working in the nursing home that I'm going to be a patient in, So we need to go outside of our comfort zone and just do something in any fashion for kids. If it's not mentoring, advocacy, foster care, and all that, I'm like, who'd ever thought like I can make furniture?
Exactly.
I mean, it's just another way that we can employ the community to be part of the solution when you believe there's no way possible that you can help. There absolutely is a way that people can help.
Yeah, and just get curious about that. What is my role? What feels right to me? How can I help? It's much better than thinking they should just, or, Department of Children and Families should, or this person should, or that person should, or the police should, or the parent should.
Yeah.
There is no they. They is we. I mean, we are, I've always said this, but the community is responsible for unwanted, abused, neglected children. They're our
Yes.
responsibility.
Yes. I heard, I guess I was listening to something recently this weekend. I don't remember what channel I heard it on. Somebody was speaking about children in care in their particular state. I think it came out of California. Essentially, children in the state, in any state, in care, in conservatorship of the state. There's been some jokes like, oh, the governor and the governor's spouse, that's my parents because that's the conservatorship of the state. But it's like, no, I'm a resident of Texas. All these children in care in Texas are part of our family. These are our children, these are our future. So there's got to be something we can all do, which leads me to the point that California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, New York, they lead the nation in tens of thousands of children being in foster care. Now, granted, they're also big states. We're a big state. We've got millions of people here. But when you've got millions of people densely populated in a state like California, Texas, Illinois, Florida, and all, and then you've got just tens of thousands of children in care there, that means there's just more millions of people to step up and do something. And even in a small community, maybe a rural community in Iowa or Nebraska, there might be a couple thousand people in the community and maybe a handful of kids in care. Well, doesn't that just inflate the numbers of how many more people can contribute to
Mm,
those children
yeah,
and the community and keeping kids out of care or getting kids back where they need to go, finding them a permanent solution? Every child is going to have a different experience in care, and every advocate's experience is different. I don't speak for the CASA program or for all advocates. We're all unique. Outcomes I've had on my cases are pretty unique. There's no cookie cutter answer for what we do. Just committing yourself passionately, being dedicated, and listening to the children and really doing that fact finding, like I said, to give the judge the best recommendation is the way we're going to get the best outcome for these kids.
absolutely. Well, anyone that is interested in being a CASA or just like wants to look into being guardian ad litem CASA can go check out your local CASA. You should just Google CASA in whatever county you are, and whatever organization should come
Well,
up.
I would say there's some naming conventions that are different among some programs. So probably the fastest way to figure this out, because there's like 97,900 CASA and GAL advocates across the country, 49 states, including the District of Columbia. If those persons interested after hearing this podcast would go to the National CASA GAL Association's main website and then select their state. And then it'll give them a list of all the organizations and the various names. One might be called Voices for Children, another might be CASA, another might be CASA GAL, another one might just be Guardian ad litem. So there's going to be all kinds of different names. But the best thing to do is go to the National CASA GAL Association's master website for the overarching program model for the nation, and then finding your state and narrowing into your community. I also have that link on my website at joanulsher.com, JOANULSHER.com. and then also a link to my local program, Child Advocate San Antonio. And again, I put the links in the back of the book as well. I just feel that it's important to share no matter where you are in the country. This is not a Joan Ulsher Buffalo, New York story or a Joan Ulsher San Antonio story. This is a national story. It's a local, regional, and national problem for these children. And anywhere you're at, there's gonna be some way that we can provide solutions to get you programmed into the right way or the right fit for advocacy.
Yes, and if you don't want the commitment of being a CASA or guardian ad litem, you can do something. There's nothing stopping you from being like Joan's neighbor was to her growing up, or Joan's boss. Like, just think about your daily interactions with people, and you can really
Paying it forward, buying ice cream, buying cookies, buying the carload of kids' meal ahead of you or behind you in the drive-through, helping mom out at Walmart. I mean, there's all kinds of ways.
Well, and you can start too by reading Joan's book, Misplaced Childhood. We'll link it in the show notes. Would you like people to go to your website to get that? Is that the best way?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. If they go to my website, they're going to learn a lot more about the book, and myself and some other advocacy efforts. And then there's some links to, like I said, to the CASA programs as a whole. But for sure, since we didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the content of the book, or the name of the book is called, yeah, Misplaced Childhood: A True Story of Resiliency and Child Advocacy. I think that readers going to that site will get a flavor for what to expect. It will be published September 19th, 2023, through Amazon and bookstores. If you don't find it on a shelf in your bookstore, you can request it from that store, whether it's Barnes and Nobles or an independent store or whatnot. And there'll be an ebook available too. And I'm planning on doing an audiobook after January. But my idea is just to get the message out there, share my story. I don't know what kind of response to get from those closest to me who've never heard a lot of the detail before. But again, the idea is that have this influence you or inspire you to be a change agent in your own community, and even start with your own family, and then go on from there.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, not only for everything you do, but providing a resource, being brave enough to tell your story, use your story for good, go through all that it takes. And I mean, like you just talked about, I don't know, what this means for people reading it that are close to my life that don't know this stuff. You have altering perceptions from your brother. So writing these things and putting ourselves out there isn't comfortable. And it does take a certain amount of bravery to choose to do good. So I want to commend you for that. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, I think somebody who had experiences like mine, or a life like mine, or maybe even an adult child who's just now leaving the foster care system, may even pick it up and realize, like, wow, my life's not over. There's still a future out there. I don't have to be a victim. I can be a survivor, and I can thrive, and I can have a purpose, and I can make a difference in another person's life.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joan, for all of your insights, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.